Shell. Historian Douglas Brinkley. And editor of The Nation, Katrina Vanden Heuvel. I'd like to start off asking Katrina, Douglas, and Jonathan to each speak for 5 minutes just about the film, their reaction to seeing it now, and maybe if you could include something that you learned, something that you didn't know before you saw these 3 hours.
First of all, what an extraordinary, extraordinary series, and we've only seen 3. So thank you to Peter and Oliver. I feel, I can't speak for my compatriots to my right, but I feel speechless after watching that last hour, but let me try to say a few words. First of all, because it closed with Henry Wallace, and part of the value, power of the film is to bring to bear those who have been written out of our history in many ways, or written out in terms of what they actually, their politics, their values. But I do think that Henry Wallace is having the last laugh, because if you go to Hyde Park today, I don't know if you know this, but because of that Monsanto sale, there is a beautiful Henry Wallace Visitor Center, just a few hundred yards from Hyde Park. So somewhere Eleanor and Franklin are there with Henry Wallace, and people, young people who come to Hyde Park learn about who Henry Wallace was. I just wanted to say that this is unknown history, and the power of it for a younger generation, I can only imagine as they, but you know, at The Nation, where I feel I've sometimes been for 147 years since it was founded by abolitionists in 1865, so much of what I saw today is part of what we try to do day in, day out, is to challenge the orthodoxy, challenge the conformity of our history, and to speak truth to power, and to bring to bear history that has either been suppressed or whitewashed, and to do it through free thinkers, through dissenters, always in the belief that perhaps the highest form of patriotism is the right of dissent. And Jonathan Shell, my colleague, fully remembers as this country went to war against Iraq, and that history is so important that we saw, because it helps us understand the militarism that so fiercely underlies our politics. The fog of national security, the fog of war, overlay Washington, and overlay much of the media, which was afraid to speak independently, and never was an independent media more needed. But criticizing a government in a time of war is not a path to popularity, as we saw, and I'm sure we will see more in the next segments. And so the old chestnut, you know, the attacks on the left is un-American, were trotted out. And I remembered, and I'm sure we'll see this in the next hour, that in 1952, at the height of the McCarthy period, The Nation published several special issues. In fact, Henry Wallace was part of 1 or 2 of them. One was called How Free is Free. And Time magazine published Richard Rovere, I think he was a New Yorker writer, who said that the issue must be, quote, causing shears, provoking shears in the Kremlin. And it is that kind of talk that I think has so congealed and stilled an important, I'd call it an alternative, not a marginalized, but an alternative narrative in history and story about America. And I do believe that the media, and certainly history, has one of the great powers, which is to define reality, not in a manipulative way, not in the manufacturing of consent, but in explaining to people what are the ideas that matter, what are the ideas you have not heard, what are the views that need to be defined and listened to, because if people don't hear those, they will not understand that there is a different America and a different world that could be imagined. And I think, and I hope that people watching this film will find in the retrieval, for example, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's words, which are often, and I think if he were alive today, some of what he said, for example, the Economic Bill of Rights, he'd be driven out of Washington, D.C. But this is not a communist past. This is a rebel, American, radical, indigenous past that you have retrieved in this film. I would simply add one thing as the film last hour we just saw. As Oliver and Peter know so well, journalism and history became casualties in the Cold War. And you lost the independent, critical-minded thought that is so crucial to a democracy. One thing we tried to do at The Nation was bring into our pages many of the historians who wrote about the bomb and who provided the truth in an alternative way of thinking about what happened in that period. And last thing I would say is the power, I thought, of learning about Jimmy Burns, learning about Leslie Groves. I'm not sure that they can be attributed with all evil, because I think there are major structural forces that underlay some of what they did. But it is important to know that such people existed, to know that the convention of 1944, even though I have to say it was quite spirited compared to some of the scripted conventions we live with today, was such a critical one. But to also know, and I know, Peter, this is so central to your work, the extraordinary conscience of the scientists, the extraordinary dissenting role that they tried to play late. I mean, Albert Einstein wrote in our pages in 1932 calling for disarmament conference. But what he did in 39, and so many of the other scientists so deeply regretted. My last point, having spent many years going to Moscow, where this World War II is the last, in a way, unifying history that country has as they fight over Stalin. What Oliver and Peter have done is a great service, because there are people in classrooms around this country who, thanks to Steven Spielberg, Tom Hanks, and with all respect to the late Stephen Ambrose, receive a history that is about how America won World War II, and America lost too many. It was terrible, but the Soviet Union and the numbers who were killed, the 27 million, which Gorbachev has spoken of, which you used as a figure, was an extraordinary sacrifice. And if we don't learn that history, we will never find a true way, first of all, to find non-military ways to deal with conflict, but to respect other countries and to have that empathy, which you spoke of and speak to in this film.